Hello friends, and welcome to episode 3 of Creation and the Creator podcast. In this podcast series, we encourage each other as Christians to take care of our environment, God's beautiful creation. So I'm Laura Digan, and I'm the minister of Whitehinge Church and part of the Sanctuary First creative team. And my guest today is Charles Howie, who is an expert in agricultural systems and a technical consultant to the charity Malawi Fruits. And today we will be exploring how climate change is changing the land for farmers and for growing produce, especially food, around the world. So, welcome, Charles. I'm so happy that you can join us today.
Thank you. Great pleasure. Feel very privileged. Thank you.
Yes, so I'm excited to see where our conversation takes us today. Now, Charles, I was doing a wee bit of research about you before we came on, and you've really travelled very extensively around the world, working, and but I am right in thinking that it all started in Scotland because you were born in Lerwick to Aberdeen parents, but then you grew up in Africa, in Uganda, and Kenya. Is that right?
It is indeed, yes. My parents decided after the winter of 1947, which was extremely cold, that cold, and there was rationing even for coal. I mean, everything was rationed at that time. I can't say I remember much about it apart from a Brussels sprout plant which survived in our garden plot. My mother always told me that sprouts tasted better after they'd been in the frost, that the life would be better, could be better outside. But I think they also had a little bit of missionary zeal to them. I think they also had a spirit of adventure. They spent their youth when they lived in Aberdeen climbing in the Cairngorms and on Skye. And there was definitely adventure there. And also, most of my Aberdeen relatives stayed within close to Aberdeen, and I think they were determined to do something very different. Mm-hmm. So in 1949, I remember going on the long sort of tunnel, similar to how you get onto an aeroplane today, but at Tilbury, Ocean Terminal, and we caught the Dunnottar Castle. And the first stop out of there was Gibraltar, where my father hauled up grapes from a man in a boat down below. We'd never seen grapes before. And then the next stop was Port Said, where a conjurer came aboard and produced a chicken out of my father's back pocket. What else? I don't know. And then eventually we went to Port Sudan, where we had a journey in a glass-bottomed boat, and we could see fish and coral down below. And then to Aden, and we took a horse and carriage up to the crater and shopped, and then to Mombasa, and then that's the port of Kenya, and then 2-night journey and 3-day journey from there to Kampala. And wow. That's how I came to go there.
Wow, what an adventure for a young boy.
Well, you could say my traveling has been involuntary, and I wasn't asked whether I want to go to Africa. I was taken. And it just became a way of life.
Yes. Yes, that's been instilled in you from a very young child, that spirit of adventure and going where actually you're led. So your parents had that, vision, to go to Africa. And what inspired you whenever you were in? I know you were taken there as a young boy, but what inspired you whenever you were growing up in Africa?
Freedom. We roamed the back lanes. We roamed all over. Eventually had a bicycle and roamed all over Kampala. We never thought of safety. We just roamed as children. As long as we turned up for meals, that was okay. Climbed a lot of climbing of trees, making houses in the back garden, which are big, lighting fires, cooking food. Quite a wild way of life in some ways. But not really conscious of the difference in wealth between my parents and the other people. I don't think that would be honest to say that. And primary school was fine. I remember climbing mango trees, eating green mangoes on the way back, and then nasty stomach ache afterwards. And the tarmac on the road bubbling, it was so hot, and we used to pierce that. But when we got home with wet tarmac on our shoes, my mother wasn't pleased. So it was just a very different way of life, which I just took as normal. I didn't think anything of it, And I think that's what children do. They normalize what's going on. So primary school in Kampala, secondary school in Nairobi.
Oh, so was that's a big city, isn't it?
It is now. It was quite big then. There was no mixed education for people. So Africans, people from Asia, there were a lot, and people from Europe went to different schools at that time. Uganda was a protectorate. It wasn't a colony. So there were no colonists. And Uganda was taken under Britain's protection in about 1903, I think, somewhere back there, because all the other bits around it had been taken up by the Congo or Italy or Germany. And there was this little bit left on the north shore of Lake Victoria. And that became Uganda.
Oh, okay.
Several kingdoms merged together. So my father, first of all, installed telephones, and then he had a lot to do with scouting and his church. And then from there, he became protectorate boys club officer, organizing boys clubs. And from there, became a community development officer, preparing people for independence, civics, economics, teaching these things, public health, in a district, and then one side of Uganda. So that was my background there. But then the world I went to when I went to school in Nairobi was very different. It was a day and a half by train. So you went on the train, 400 or 500 schoolboys. You can imagine what that was like.
Yeah, wild.
Wild. I mean, the train went so slowly across the Rift Valley, you could actually get off, hitchhike to the next station, go and have a meal, and go to the station and catch a train.
Oh, wow. So was it whenever you were there, because I know that you went on to study biology, was it while you were in Africa, that desire to study science and biology in particular, was that whenever that desire began?
I think a couple of reasons. One is I found I enjoyed it. And I found the likes of physics and chemistry a bit of a mountain, but biology seemed to make a lot more sense. And the other was probably from my mother. My mother when she left school, was the lab assistant to a professor in Aberdeen University, Professor Black, who was writing the Flora of Siam.
Oh.
And she was just good at drawing and very interested in plants. And part of it came from that. And yeah, I mean, my interest in botany came from my mother, I think, definitely, and is more so latterly these days. And it began with an argument with my mother in the garden, which I can still remember. She said, she took me to weed the garden with her, right? So, Charles, those are zinnias, those are dahlias, and those are weeds, and so are those. So I said, I can see the dahlias and the zinnias have different leaves, but those things you call weeds are actually different plants. So I was into the logic of classification, if you like.
Yes.
And then I worked out, of course, my mother meant a weed was anything at all growing where you didn't want it to, which didn't seem to be in the least bit scientific.
Yeah.
And I think part of it came from that.
So you've got that interest, as a young man, in biology. But when did you particularly become interested in agriculture systems?
Well, that happened in Aberdeenshire, because every 3 years, my father worked for the East African Post and Telegraphs, and then later the Colonial Service. Every 3 years, you got 6 months back in the UK. So in 1952, when we came back the first time, there were a family of 6 of us, and looking for accommodation for 6 people for 6 months was pricey. So my father commissioned a sale and return caravan made by somebody in Essex, a small builder. And that's what my parents used. I actually stayed with one of my father's engineering friends in Southampton, which is where we'd actually been when we went to Africa.
Uh-huh.
And so I spent part of the time there. But then they toured all over the place and landed up in a small quarry near Tarland, Chiliprony in Aberdeenshire. And when I got there, I needed something to do. So my father said, would you like to go? Should we go to the farm? So there were a couple of farms near us. So I
Yeah.
went with my father to a farm down a path.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, that was fine. So the first afternoon after he'd gone off, I sat on a hay rake, which had a great big saucer of a seat. Two of us sat on that with a horse pulling it, and then pulled the lever at the end
Uh-huh.
of the road to let it down. The next day, when they were making hay, which was collecting it in,
Yes.
because I was the smallest and feeblest, they then sat me on the Massey Ferguson tractor. So I then drove.
Oh, my son he was fascinated by tractors whenever he was a wee boy. And oh yeah, I've become actually that I now know all these tractors, Charles. Carry on, sorry for interrupting you.
I'm glad it produces happy memories. I mean, I see them now and you think, my goodness, I could almost fit that into a matchbox compared to the beasts that you see going around now. So anyway, I worked on this farm for about 6 weeks. And I learned about crop rotation, the 7-year
Yes.
cycles, which do things for the sun. We had oats and underlay of grass, two of grass, and then a couple of root crops, and then oats again. So that
Yeah.
was what people did.
Uh-huh.
So these two farmers worked together. I mean, there was no toilet, there was a midden. And every afternoon at 4 o'clock, the ladies of the family brought oatcakes and smokies and all sorts of stuff to eat in the field, which we did. And it was an idyllic form of life in some ways. But one day, going between the two farms down the road, and I did actually go there a couple of years ago with my family, but the farm
Uh-huh.
is now deserted, knocked down. But anyway, we looked over a wall, and there in the distance was a combine harvester,
Ooh.
because we had been busy cutting oats, and we had a machine like the thing they take up the back of your hair, like
Yes.
this. And then that fell onto a belt, and then it was wrapped up, fell off the other side, and then you had to
Yes.
pick them up and make a stook with the sheep.
Yes. Yes.
That chapped your ankles and chapped your arms badly. And we'd just been doing that, and this was a machine which took away all that need for labor. And I suppose I've seen one thing in agriculture, we'll get there at the end. It has been the way machinery has changed agriculture.
Yeah. So you had studied at university, and then you've been a teacher. You've also been a lecturer at universities, and you've been all around the world advising on farming. And I see that I was actually particularly fascinated. I know that you've been to the Antarctic Islands. You've been in Bangladesh. You've been in the Mekong Delta. Is that in Vietnam? Am I right?
Yes.
Yes. And you've been in Africa. And so, what kind of work have you? I know it'll been all very varied, but what kind of work were you doing with the farmers with the land? Um,
Well, the farming really only gets going again in 1998.
mhm.
So between really the 50s and the 90s, 40 years, where I'm away doing other things.
Uh huh.
So I go to the Antarctic because I didn't want to become a school teacher. I only had a teaching certificate, and I could only teach in a secondary modern school in those days in England. And I tell you, the attitude towards education, comparing the students I taught in Africa, who complained if they didn't get homework every night because they pay, please, so you must set us homework, we pay to come to school.
Ah,
I
yes.
never met that enthusiasm in 20 years in classrooms in Scotland, I'm sad to say.
Yeah.
So that determined me to be a teacher. I could also see the step difference it made to people's lives through education. I
Yes.
see that in Africa very, very clearly. Absolutely.
Uh-huh.
So it was partly just a wish for a bit more adventure, partly a wish to do a sidestep round teaching a second modern school, And if I was older, I knew I could get into university without hires, which I failed.
Yeah. So what was can I ask you, like, what was Antarctica like, Charles?
You could say sometimes very boring. You're with the same people. In our case, you'd be the same people for 6 or 8 months at a time.
Oh, okay.
So
Yeah.
you definitely had to learn how to get on with people.
Mhm.
The first island was a volcanic island. The beaches would steam. 2 years after I left, it blew up. The base was flattened,
Oh my goodness.
which we didn't have a real plan as to what we would do. In fact, it was Argentina's icebreaker that went down and rescued the guys.
Oh,
It
okay.
was in the late 1960s.
Uh-huh.
So that was very interesting. But one bit of botany did come out of that, which I think is important, is that I was told there was a plant on the outer side. This is a ring of cones called Deception Island, and a great big bay in the middle. All the fumaroles are on the beach, and there were 1 or 2 smoking bits at the top. So anyway, I climbed over the ridge, which is about 1,000 feet high, slightly down the other side, and I found a rock face, and there were small pinks, colobanthus, little patches of this plant. And I measured them in 1964. I took a compass and measuring equipment because I
Yes.
actually fixed it down on the map. And in 1964, that patch measured 19 yards by 4. In 2004, I sat next to the reunion dinner to the British Antarctic Survey's botanist, and he said it was now 200 meters by 50 meters.
Wow.
Now, that's a part of the world that has heated enormously with climate change, but it
Yes.
could also have been from heating underneath, or volcanoes actually produce nutritious material, which actually
Yes.
produces growth. So then, but that impressed me. I'd done something that was seminal, because if I hadn't measured then, Lewis Smith wouldn't have known in 2004 when he visited it how much it had grown. So
Yes.
that brought home to me the importance of recording things that I saw.
Mhm.
That was very important. It also gave me a feeling of legitimacy as a scientist in a way. I felt
Yes.
it was something useful at that point. Now, the British Antarctic Survey now is enormous. It's one of the premier institutes for knowing about climate change,
Yeah.
because all sorts of things. And they don't go run with dogs measuring and surveying, what can be seen, which is what was going on in my time. Very
Mhm.
much now it's about theorizing about changes, and then what evidence would we see if that is happening, and then going to specific places to look for the evidence,
Right.
understanding the interglacial periods, understanding what's happening as the ice cap melts, how that's going to affect all the water currents around the whole globe.
Yeah. It's vital work.
Yes. So in retrospect, I've got as much out of the Antarctic Survey latterly by understanding what they're doing as I did at the time, which
Uh,
was exciting. And I spent this second year on another small island of botanists, where there were lots of people. There were half a dozen of somebody doing fish, somebody doing penguin eggs, a couple of us doing ornithology, but just cooking, cleaning, keeping life going takes up a lot of time. If
yeah.
you can't run down to the shop for anything, everything's got to be there, or you've got to devise it.
Yes.
So you become inventive.
Yes. Uh-huh. An inventive, creative adventurer. And so you said that later on, it was like later on in life that you then came back to the farming, and like working in the different countries,
Yes.
Bangladesh and in Vietnam. And so what kind of work were you doing with farmers there, Charles?
Well, Bangladesh, it was British Council, which is a sort of British cultural organisation, the government's cultural branch. And there I was dealing with science, but I also could see farming, and I could see the problems. There was, I mean, Bangladesh's population at that time was about 70 million and growing at an enormous rate. This is in 1969, 1971,
Mhm.
growing at an enormous rate. And agriculture wasn't keeping up with it, so there was starvation. But it also meant people who were desperate farmed on tiny little bits of land that were exposed outside the flood season.
Yeah.
Now, in in 1970, in November 1970, the Brahmaputra and Ganges rivers, which both flow through Bangladesh, and the delta, Bangladesh is a delta, most of it, they were both in flood. There was the equinox high tides, which pushed the river up, and at the same time, a cyclone blew up from the Indian Ocean.
Oh my goodness.
And the flooding killed probably 300,000 people in a night.
Oh my goodness.
We don't often talk about that, but that was very, very stark. That really, having been around at a time like that, and just the insight it gave me into what the rest of the world is like, and how benign our climate and our living conditions are here, which has probably stayed with me.
Yes.
So that was quite important, really. Then I went and taught biology for 20 years and enjoyed doing that. And then I went off and did other things with government. But in 1998, I walked all away from that, and began a degree, a master's degree in sustainable agricultural systems at the Agricultural University in Cirencester, Royal Agricultural. And instead of doing European agriculture for my master's dissertation, I decided to do something utterly different. So I thought, no, I'm not going back to Africa. I really want to go and do something more exciting. And I read a book about rice, and I had to summarize it in 70 words over the Christmas holidays, which was fascinating.
Yeah.
And at the end, I went to see my tutor, who happened to be the vice principal, and I said, I'd like to do something on rice. He said, well, I've got contacts in Vietnam and in the Philippines at the International Rice Research Institute. And out there's the Agricultural Trust, which is offering traveling scholarships. You could always apply. I applied, and by return of post, I got a check for £750 to go to Vietnam.
Wow.
That in some ways is a God moment for me.
Yes.
There are things that happened, which looking back, you put them together and you join them up.
Yeah.
And it's not just chance. And I think that's probably the basis of my faith in some ways.
Yes.
It appear to be by chance and not by chance.
Yeah.
And I went and I met, I flew on Aeroflot through Russia, got there, got a hydrofoil boat to the middle of the Mekong Delta, arrived at 11:30 at the university in the middle of the Delta. And of course, everyone had gone for lunch. And then they stopped for 2 hours in the middle of the day. So that was utterly confusing.
Yes.
I stayed for 10 days or so. I went and saw one farmer at the edge of the Mekong Delta. And what interested me was when I arrived, they had, with great difficulty, to help me to get up a muddy bank about 10 feet up to the bank. And there was rice growing inside the field.
Yes.
But when I left, I stepped from the top of the bank into the boat.
Right.
Because it was tidal.
Oh, okay. Right.
And it's so flat, the tide, you can see that influence, that fluctuation, 200 kilometers up the river. That's what happens in these great big rivers systems. And partly that, and partly I met the man who was Vietnam's most famous rice science politician, called Dr. Vo Tong Sun. And after I only met him for 20 minutes. We had an interesting discussion. And I asked his staff about all sorts of things. And I went back to Bangladesh and asked them about what I was interested in was the potential effect of sea level rise, salt on rice production, which is a big issue. And I went to Bangladesh as well on the way back, which was quite nice because I saw Bangladesh in peace, whereas I'd left it as a civil war was breaking out, literally round the street corners from me. And so when I finished, I sent him a copy of my dissertation, Bertong Sun. And I said, I'd like to come back. And he said, well, you've got no money. And there are problems that the shrimp farmers who like the salty water and the rice farmers are having a dispute. I think they were having a bit of a punch up on the side.
Oh, okay.
Water control. But he said, I've just been made rector for only the second university for 18 million people. Would you like to come and write Vietnam's first curriculum in rural development?
What an opportunity!
Wetty palm time. So in the course of doing that with 20 people and the province's one translator, a lady who now is researcher in America, I learned a vast amount of agriculture just through listening to them, visiting farmers, developing a curriculum. I had to learn all sorts of things, which I did. And they wrote the curriculum and then went on and then did research with farmers, sitting with farmers, asking them about how they did agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
What were not so much what were the problems, I just want to understand how things worked. And they gave me a description of water control, cooperation, the problems with rice. I just learned a lot about farming by sitting with farmers. I think I spent about 200 hours sitting on floor listening with farmers.
So Charles, now I know myself just from having watched some shows on TV, some documentaries, and I know in particular that Bangladesh is, they're having a lot of problems due to climate change, and people from the countryside are being completely flooded and then going to the cities, but the cities are now so crowded.
Yes.
I'm just wondering how, from what you've seen over the years, how have you seen like the land change in the various countries you've been in? And is climate change, like to your expert eye, having an impact on like the land, where we produce, our food?
Yes. I held up my coffee cup when we began because coffee is a crop that is going to be affected by warming.
Yes.
But it's not all. We'll come back to coffee later because there's something interesting about that. But what I have seen is in Vietnam, which has gone from being one of the world's poorest countries to a middle-income country in the course of 25 years. And I was back there last year doing aquaculture with the University of Scotland. Is land has been amalgamated, more technology, dikes have been built to a height which keeps out all the water. So there's less chance of flooding, but the land is getting harder. They're needing to use more and more fertilizer. They're reconsidering making holes in the dikes to let water come in every so many years. But if you've started growing perennial crops, they don't like being flooded. If you've got cattle, they can't swim. No, I'm not being facetious. And if you're growing fish, but they've done this anyway, they would actually put a net wall around their fish pond during the flood season, so the fish couldn't escape.
Right.
So that's deviating a bit. What I have seen, though, is there's amalgamation of fields, there's labor leaving the land. But what Vietnam has done, it has provided education. I mean, I was there helping only the second university for 18 million people. There are probably 15 or 20 universities in the Mekong Delta now.
Right, okay.
So as they built dikes and produced better rice, more and more rice, they exported, they built hospitals. I've seen a 40-hectare paddy field turn into a university for 10,000 students and a modern hospital in the course of 20 years. So education and technology is helping, but I don't know the answer to the bigger question for Bangladesh.
Yes.
It hasn't the same, its geography is different. There are many plans for the Mekong Delta. Some of them involve putting, and I've seen one of them, involve putting gates. London has a barrier.
Yes.
Gates that go up and down like this. Well, there's a system for doing something similar now in one part of the Mekong Delta. Another thing to do is to build bunds, to build walls around city areas so they can't be flooded.
Yes, I had read an article actually about that, about is it like green and blue zones they call it?
Right.
Something like that, yeah. And about how you can do that within cities that because I think in China they've did a lot of this planning to prevent flooding
Yes.
in certain areas, and it's blue and green zones they call it. So I think it's to manage the water that's there, but also make, I don't know, it must be like more green space that can absorb the
Yes.
water. Yeah.
But we think of it just as climate change. Maybe that's going to be sea level rise, but there are actually lots of moving parts in the same scene.
Yeah.
So, example, in Vietnam, you've got sea level rise, and if it comes in a long way, it is going to affect. You've also got China has built 23 dams on the Mekong River.
Right. Yes.
Laos is putting in dams. Cambodia would like to have a dam because they want electricity.
Yes.
I mean, one of the reasons which the West never absorbed for China building the 3 dams gorge, which dam system, which we all thought was terrible, was said to be terrible, was actually to stop thousands and thousands of deaths. Back in the 30s, China had thousands of people who died in that area from flooding.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another thing, is hydro dams. But the bit that's harder to predict, I think, is changing rainfall patterns in the catchment area. So Vietnam, the Mekong River has an enormous, great catchment area. A lot of the catchment area is up in China. And then it stops really falling sharply as it enters Laos,
Yes.
out of China. From there to the sea of Vietnam, it isn't flat, but there's not much movement. There's not much fall in depth. So there's many different cogs, and another cog is Vietnam's population growth has slowed on the one hand, so they're having fewer children.
Yes.
But on the other hand, people are living longer.
Yes.
And as they live longer, their food requirements change. Also, as they move from countryside, where they're doing manual work, to doing office work or factory work, their food requirements will change.
Yes.
So there's many, many parts.
Yes.
I think the most significant for rice, though, has to do with temperature. Some years ago, a man called Gurdev Kush at the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines, using their data that they had over a long period of time, was able to show that a 1 degree rise in mean nighttime temperature led to a 10% decrease in rice yields.
Oh, okay.
Because
yes.
if the temperature is above a certain level, inside the cells that produce the pollen, the nuclei don't divide properly.
Okay, so that would have a huge impact then on a country's ability to feed itself and also export produce around the world. Yes.
But another positive side, which will take social acceptance, is I think it's highly likely that we will find DNA which we can put into plants to help them to survive. I know people say genetic modification is horrible, but we've got 8 billion people to feed now, 9 billion people to feed.
Yeah.
And we need to keep on focused on how we're going to feed those people sometimes. Mm-hmm. And I find that's being lost. I was sitting drawing plants in the Botanic Garden in Edinburgh, in the herbarium. They've got 3.5 million sheets of mounted plants, representing about a third of all the world's plants. That is a Fort Knox of DNA.
Yes. Yeah, because as well, I was reading about the seed library in, is it Svalbard?
Yes.
Yes, and that I just think that's it's like a treasury, isn't it? All these seeds from around the world, just fascinating, and it's wonderful. Actually, we've got that treasure there, and it'll keep it safe. But we don't want to be losing the seeds that we've got. We want them to be able to be like in their natural habitat and growing wild and free, and being able to produce what they're meant to produce. Now, Charles, you had mentioned coffee, and you said that you've got a story about coffee, because coffee could be one of the products that actually is impacted by climate change.
And I'm a drinker. Right. Coffee is going to be impacted by climate change. And I heard on the radio a couple of years ago, a man head of coffee at Kew Gardens in London. He was talking about having rediscovered a variety of coffee growing in a West African country, which would survive a higher temperature.
Okay.
So I cheekily wrote to him and said, and who will benefit from that?
Yes.
Because in 1992, in Rio de Janeiro, the United Nations Convention on Biodiversity was signed by many countries, which gives intellectual property rights to the country and the community amongst which discoveries are made.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's been a lot of theft of plants. For example, rubber was stolen. Yes, I think that's not too unkind a word to use, from Brazil,
Mm-hmm.
and grown by us. And within 10, probably 20 years, Brazil's wild rubber industry had been destroyed. So I think it's important to recognize, to think about who owns these plants. That the higher lands in Africa will now become very important for growing coffee. Partly they're volcanic, which is nutritious, and partly they're at an altitude which won't experience sort of climate change that's going to happen in lower areas.
Uh-huh.
So the likes of Malawi, which has very few exportable crops, I can foresee in the future is likely to be a choice spot for growers. The question is, the highlands at the north, which is where I've been working, the question is, who will get the benefit of that? Is it going to be big international growers, or will Malawi itself be the principal beneficiary?
Yes. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. So there's ethical questions,
Big,
to
big
be
moral
asked.
and ethical questions there. Very
Yeah.
big.
Uh-huh. Yes. So you have so you mentioned Malawi. So you have been because you've been working with Malawi fruits, and so are they, because there's a lot here about thinking, being forward thinking, isn't there? And about using technology, to help farmers to be able to produce, and also to see the opportunities where maybe new things can happen. So what kind of things have you been working with the farmers in Malawi?
Well, we've been working with solar powered irrigation. So a solar panel
Uh-huh.
and a water pump can lift 3.5 tons of water an hour, which is quite a lot.
Yes.
So the charity that I'm in, Malawi Fruits, had been going for some years before I joined them, and it actually came
Mhm.
about through a chance conversation over coffee in the Episcopal Church here in Dunoon. I found myself having breakfast with somebody in Stracher on Loch Fyne the next day, and a week later in a Waitrose in Stirling, and a few days later with this group of people in Canal Street in Glasgow.
Uh-huh. Another
Who
God moment, Charles.
a sort of zigzag. Yes, you're
Yeah.
in.
Uh-huh.
Um, and so that's where it began. They tried various things,
Mm-hmm.
but these were a group of businessmen,
Uh-huh.
and they were uncomfortable about giving, as in just giving.
Yes.
They
Uh-huh.
were uncomfortable about. They wanted to be effective. They wanted to have impact
Yes.
at
Uh-huh.
that end.
Mm-hmm.
So we went from lending people money to be repaid for growing cayenne,
Yes.
for growing, no, it was paprika, that's it.
Mm-hmm.
I was looking at my mantelpiece because I had one there and then it disintegrated with the insects recently. But growing paprika, and that
Uh-huh.
was a donor you gave and they repaid afterwards, but there was no repayments made because it was a gift from God. But
Yes.
there's next time, what happens next time?
Yeah.
So we sat down, a group of us, and thought about how to grow tomatoes more effectively, because people eat maize meal, sema, and tomato sauce, maybe some vegetables, and occasionally a bit of protein, chicken.
Uh-huh.
That's the main diet.
Uh-huh.
And we worked out that if we could build a polytunnel which was 19 meters by 13 meters by 9, we could get 300 sacks of plants in there, tomato plants. If we had high quality tomato plants, we could get 10 to 15 kilos per plant twice a year. And so I instigated that we needed to talk with people about that. So we didn't talk with them, but we engaged a third party, a neutral party, to help focus groups with women.
Uh-huh.
We'd said we're thinking of doing this. People have just said yes,
Yeah.
but we wanted to know what the real issues were.
Yeah.
So women didn't own land in the north, so they couldn't grow on soil.
Uh-huh.
So with polythene sacks and a greenhouse, you can put it anywhere. You put it on a car park, doesn't matter.
Yes.
They could fit it around childcare. They could have it next door to their houses. They could support each other. Maybe
Yes.
one of them would do all the work. All three would invest. One of them would do all the work, and they'd pay that person and share the profits.
Yeah.
So we not only then went for solar-powered water pumping, drip irrigation, which is a plastic pipe with little holes in it
Yeah.
at appropriate points. We then went for solar-powered cold store. So we've got several of those, but we don't actually use them as much as we'd like to, because the produce we get is being bought as it's brought in.
Mm-hmm.
So no big grower, and that when we went into supermarkets in the north of Malawi, all the fresh fruit and vegetables come from South Africa,
Right.
which
Okay.
we just we thought we could do better than that, particularly as it's a country which has very little foreign exchange.
Yes.
So this is import substitution.
Uh-huh.
So we've got about 120 groups of women growing tomatoes, and then they're aggregated. They pay half of it at the beginning, and half of it they pay off, and they grow under contract. So we
Yes.
supply high quality seedlings, stuff to go in their sacks, extension services, advice, and then selling points. So we buy everything, and because we then are taking 30 kilos from there, 50 kilos from there,
Yeah.
we've got hundreds and hundreds of kilos to sell, and big buyers will come and get them.
Yes. Uh-huh.
And traders, middle people are coming buying. We're sort of wholesaling tomatoes.
Yes.
We
Uh-huh.
also, with some women, have diversified and they've gone into growing green peppers.
Mm-hmm.
But when I went to see them last year, sad tale,
Oh.
somebody had cut a hole in the back of one of our greenhouses, let their goats in, and they had eaten £1,000 worth of green peppers.
Oh my goodness. Oh dear.
So there's all sorts of social issues to be addressed as well.
Yes, uh-huh. But it sounds as if like it's very empowering, starting, at grassroots level, and then empowering, especially women, to be able to give them an income and, a skill as well, that then in a
Yeah.
business that can actually grow. And so from our conversation, I'm picking up here that, there's this actually how you actually tackle um, the effects of climate change. This is me just listening to you. There's something here about engaging with others.
Yeah.
Not doing things in isolation. Engaging with communities, seeing actually what their needs are, um, being forward thinking, and actually not being frightened of technology and being creative and the use of technology to be able to help deal with the impact, and also think about actually what issues could be in the future, but also what opportunities there actually can be in
Mm.
the future. Now, I'm wondering then, so this is me just like from what I've heard from you, but as an expert in the field, Charles, how do you think farmers can be best supported, to navigate the effects of climate change?
We're talking generally, or developing countries, or
I think probably generally. I think generally because I think it can be, people out there, Charles, think that there's nothing that we can do,
um,
and I think there's quite a lot of people that are quite pessimistic and think, oh, well, it's going to happen. So, oh, but there's nothing that I can do. There's nothing we can do.
mm.
So I'm just wondering, like, in general, how do you think farmers can be supported?
Well, I think technology, and by technology, I mean intellectually now, a plant is regarded as a technology. So farmers talk about, maybe my farmer friends in Vietnam will say, we've got this technology or that technology. They're actually meaning plants or animals.
Okay.
So there is what we think of mechanical technologies,
Mm-hmm.
and we can now harvest and do immense numbers of things with machines.
Uh-huh.
We can also do things to plants as I've described. I think that'll take a lot more social acceptance. But I think we need to bear in mind why this is happening. If you go back 9,000 years before Christ, you find at that time people stopped going and collecting in wild rice and started planting it.
Yes.
And the British Antarctic Survey and their cores of
Mm-hmm.
ice show that it's about that point that instead of the interglacial period which we were in, instead of the temperature going down as it had previously, it did a hockey stick turn.
Right.
So our own agriculture is, and feeding the billions of people we've got now, we are overall the cause of where we are.
Yes.
And I
Uh-huh.
think it's important to remember that.
Yes.
We have done this. I mean, in one sense, I ask myself, why on earth is God allowing this to happen? Are we escaping from His word? But we love one another as I love you, and I just reconciling these things I find very difficult. But anyway, to go back to where we were, I think the danger to agriculture is probably as much economic. People trying to undercut each other and make farming unviable economically in different places. There's Malawi. It could produce so much of its own food, but it's found it easier to buy from elsewhere because it just hasn't, for various reasons, it hasn't developed that commercial network of medium-scale agriculture, which is what
Yes.
we're engaged in doing.
Uh-huh.
I think there'll be constant adaptation. I take in mind a man called David Brailsford, who was head of British Cycling, who said, British cycling rose to a peak 2012 and is still
Yes.
largely there.
Uh-huh.
Can I make 1% difference here, 1% difference here, 2% there? And it's going to be a whole lot of small things going on that we need to do. For example, at the moment, I've just finished reviewing this book, which is about dairying in the 21st century.
Okay.
And this mentions to some extent the possibility, well, not the possibility, that by feeding cattle some seaweed in their diet, they can reduce 80 to 90% of the methane they emit.
Oh.
So that's an example of technology.
Yes. Yes. Uh-huh.
So then I asked AI GPT, ChatGPT, what does seaweed do in the rumen of cattle? And I found out it was something called bromoform. Bromoform inhibits the enzymes that is in the metabolic pathway for digesting carbohydrate, starch.
Okay. Uh-huh.
Now, it's those sort of developments, discoveries, that are important.
Yes. Uh-huh. And so for people not to be actually frightened of technology or frightened of developments of science, but instead to embrace them in a way.
Well, but going from hunting wild bits of rice to planting it, that was a technological breakthrough.
Yeah. Uh-huh. Yes. It was like genius, wasn't it? It was really quite a genius step. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh-huh. And so
Not
as
sure I've really answered your question.
but so as Christians, what do you think we should be doing to support farmers around the world? Is there anything in particular you think we should be doing, Charles?
I think we should value the food that we have, waste less of it, don't buy more than we need to at one time. I know as a single person, I go to a vegetable shop which has boxes, and you pick out what you want. Now, for a single person, that means I can have variety without having to have a bag of this, a bag of this, and a bag of that.
Yeah.
which is less variety, and some of it may go off before I've used it. So I think personally, being selective in what we buy, trying to buy from this country wherever we can, looking at the air miles, how far have things come? Because that's another thing. So this is about the interweaving of agricultural technology and business. The two of them are, they're just completely interwoven like this.
And yes.
It's penetrating one without destroying the other, because it's people's livelihoods at the grower's end.
Yeah, so it's like us being conscious
Yeah,
consumers.
and I think making the technologies that we discover available freely to developing countries.
Yes.
I think that's very important. And going on, having a culture from this country, particularly, of our scientific discoveries and making those available worldwide. I mean, we do scientifically for our population, we're quite significant. We're very significant. And I think the research that goes on in this country can make a difference.
Yes.
It really can.
Yeah, so making
I think,
ourselves aware of that, and also like maybe putting pressure on government, asking our representatives, to make these things available. Yeah.
yes, yes, and to support the research that goes behind them. For
Yes.
example, we all are told to eat oily fish. And I was curious about this, but after I'd been to Vietnam last year, somebody asked me to review their paper. And from it, I discovered that they were feeding their catfish, and they were feeding the brood stock, they were feeding them omega oils to see if it improved the offspring.
Yes.
And then I discovered, reading around, that actually fish don't make omega oils. It's made by algae. And all that fish do for us is to harvest it.
Right.
In research for this book the other day, looking into seaweeds, I found that there's an offshoot of Heriot-Watt University, which is actually growing unicellular green algae in culture in order to extract and sell the omega oil.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, that's
There's a
fascinating.
takeaway from today.
Yes. Now, Charles, I'm wondering, finally, because you've spoken about God throughout this discussion, and I'm wondering, how does your faith influence your work, but also vice versa? How does your work influence your faith?
Well, let's take the second bit first. Looking back, I mean, I said that, I met a man in the church, and then I'm getting involved in Malawi.
Yes.
Looking back, I can see two occasions when, it was binary. Am I going to survive this situation or not? Life and death. Once in a civil war and once in the Antarctic, falling through sea ice at -15. And I look at those and I think there must be some purpose to me not dying on both of those occasions. Therefore, there must be a purpose for me to be alive.
Yeah.
Therefore, somebody wants me to be alive. And I think that's become important to me looking back. I mean, I wouldn't have said that 15 or 20 years ago, but looking back now on the succession of events that have happened and how things now have connected. I mean, going to Malawi was no great shock. I get out of the airport and it's Africa.
Yeah.
It smells like Uganda. And I just can see there's been a plan. I've not been aware of it. But now looking back, I can see things are connected.
Yes.
I couldn't do what I'm doing now, either what I did with Stirling University or with Malawi Fruits or for Angyang University. I couldn't have done any of those things without what went on back there.
Yes.
All the way from arguing with my mother over plants. But in terms of my work, it does give me faith that I will be looked after and I'll be guided. I don't always trust. I'm a terrible doubter. And I really, I can doubt anything. But I think it's given me faith that there is purpose for me in my life. And I've found your daily broadcast. Very informative as well. Thank you very much.
And well, do you know, Charles, this has been a wonderful discussion with you, and I actually think you need to write a book about your life, because I could sit here for hours chatting with you, because you've just had such a fascinating life. But I would like to say, and I hope other people feel the same after listening to this discussion, I actually feel really hopeful about the future, because sometimes I can be a bit despondent about the effects of, climate change and all the other things that we're doing to destroy, the world, through our activity. And I actually feel really hopeful that actually we can do something. We can, if we work together, and if we embrace the technologies, and if we all do our wee part, and if we can actually do something to care for God's creation, and to halt the effects of like runaway climate change and all the other things. So thank you so much for coming on and sharing this. It's just been wonderful to chat with you today.
It's been a privilege. Thank you very much.
Mm.
I appreciate your asking me. And I didn't really choose this route. Stepping onto Dunnottar Castle, age 7 in 1949, was probably when the die was cast.
Yeah. That's it. God's had it in his hand. He's had a plan the whole time. Yes. Yeah. Oh, well, thank you so much for joining me, Charles, for this really thought-provoking, inspiring discussion. And if you friends have been inspired, to do share your comments, and do consider also joining us for our Sanctuary First Creation and the Creator discussion group. Our next online meeting will be Wednesday, the 26th of June at 7:30. Hopefully Charles can be there too, and you can talk to Charles and ask him your own questions as well at that time. But if you would like to maybe ask more questions, or look for more details about the Creation and the Creator podcast, the whole series, or the discussion group, or anything else at all, please do get in touch with me at Laura Digan. So that's LDIGAN at churchofscotland.org.uk. So L Digan at churchofscotland.org.uk, and Digan is spelled DIGAN. So friends, thank you so much for listening, for joining with us today. And we look forward to our next podcast, and I do look forward to seeing some of you as well at our discussion group at the end of June. But until then, friends, take care and bye for now.